All right. So before we dive into some of the most used hooks within the React ecosystem, let's talk a little bit about what they actually are in theory. So hooks essentially are functionality that allows us to utilize React features in functional components. So before we had functional components, when we had class components, we wouldn't need hooks. Because to do something like, for example, run something at the beginning when a component renders, we would override the component will mount or component did mount lifecycle method and put our code there. Because in React with functional components, we can't override those methods, we need another way to access those React functionalities, and that way is using hooks. So using hooks in and of themselves, it's not very difficult. The complexity really comes down to writing custom hooks and the amount of hooks that there are, because React itself has quite a few hooks that you can use, which all do their own separate thing. You know, maybe if you're working on a project in some company, they have their own custom hooks, which you also need to understand how they work. And if you're using libraries, of course, libraries may have their own hooks as well. And all of that combines together, and there are just quite a few to learn. But today, we'll be going over the basic two hooks that really are used most of all, I would say. And understanding them will guide you to a good path to being able to figure out all of the other hooks based on the fundamentals that we'll be understanding here today. All right, so the first hook that we'll be looking at is something called the use state hook. So as you can imagine from the name, what this hook actually does is allow us to use state within a functional React component. So what I have here is just a basic create React app React project. Very simple, very standard. I have it running, and in the browser you can see the result. We have this React base starter project. So let's go over the use state hook and what it does. Let's first of all import use state from React, just so that we have access to it. And to use it, we just write something like this: const, then open square brackets. Let's call it name, and then set name equals use state. And then we'll pass in an initial value. In this case, let's just pass in an empty value. So as you can already imagine, just intuitively, how this works, the initial input that it takes is the initial state that will be stored in this name state, right? So it gives us back the value of the state and a setter method to set the value of that state. Pretty simple stuff. So let's test it out. Let's add in a name here. So my name is Sen. We'll just put in Sen. And let's then call on this on click. Let's get rid of this href. We'll just say on click set name not Sen. And then what we'll do here is on every render, we'll just log the name. Just like that. There you go. So we're giving it the initial value Sen. It'll give us that value here. We'll log that on every single render. Log that value right here. And when we click on this Learn React button, it'll set the name to not Sen. So let's test it out. Let's see what happens. Let's open up the console here. Let's refresh. All right, and there you go. So you can see at first it'll render, it gives us the name sen, right? So this is this console log right here being outputted to the console. I'm actually make this a little bit bigger just so that you guys can maybe see better. There you go. So yeah, you can see it outputs it to the console name sen. Now let's click on this learn React here. And there you go. You can see that that actually sets this name to not sen and re-renders, right? So there you go. So this is the use state hook. This is how it works. Here's what is important to understand about it. It doesn't update name, right? It updates the state in this use state hook, right? And then reruns app, so re-renders with this new state. So let me demonstrate what I mean here. Let's just create an object here, and we can of course put objects into state. And in this object, we'll say the name is going to be sen, right? Now, here's what we'll do. We will say set timeout, which will just run something with a delay. And let's run it with a delay of 10 seconds. So that's 10,000 milliseconds, right? And in this set timeout, let's console.log timeout name. And then we'll also log, without the timeout, the name, right? Name, just like that. So here is what's happening. And then let's also update this to name not sen. There you go. So that'll set as an object, right? So what are we doing here? We have this object with the value name sen stored in the state of name, right? We log that to the console on every render. And then on every render, we wait 10 seconds and then log that name object as well. So let's demonstrate this. Let's refresh so you can see name is sen. Let's click Learn React. There you go. It sets it to not sen. And now you'll see in a second here, this timeout will run. And there you go. You see the name is still sen. So it doesn't update the original object. It re-renders with a new one, right? So if you're working with the given code, don't expect it to update an object that you put in there. It's a small thing, but if you don't understand it, it may come back and be quite difficult to troubleshoot and deal with in the future. So understand that it doesn't actually update whatever state you have. It re-renders with new state. Okay, so one last thing that's important to understand with state before we go on to the next hook is that you shouldn't call set state in the actual render method. So what do I mean by that? Let's remove this set timeout. We can remove this console. Never call something like set name in this actual render method. You see that? Why? Because it'll run, right? So let's imagine the render method running. It'll call set name, and then that'll trigger a re-render. So this method will run again, right? And it'll call set name again, and that'll trigger a re-render again, and again, and you get an infinite loop, right? So that's why you should never call set a set method of use state within the actual render method. Call it in a button handler, or if you're maybe getting some response from a server, from a backend API, you can call set state there. Just some situation that's not actually in the render method. So if we go to our code right now, to the actual running project, you'll see that React actually gives us a too many re-renders error, because that's exactly what's happening. It calls set name, it sees set name again, it re-renders, then it sees set name, it re-renders, and so on and so on. So if you see this error, that's why it's happening. Okay, So now that we understand the use state hook, let's move to the next one. Let's talk about use effect. What if we wanted to output the value of name like this, console.log name? What if we wanted to output this value but only once, only when the component mounts and not at any other time? Right now, we can't do that, right? So it'll output at the beginning, but every time we set send, every time the component renders, it's gonna console.log this name. Well, that's where the use effect hook comes in. Let's import the use effect hook, and let's use it right now to output this name only once. So here's what we'll do. We'll call use effect, right? We'll pass it in something called a setup function, which will run the use in every single time the effect is called. In that setup function, we'll put our console.log, and then we'll pass it a dependency array. The dependency array we'll go over a little bit more in just a second, but essentially any value that we put into the dependency array, every single time it changes, it'll run the setup function. Right now, we'll leave it empty. So it'll run only once, only at the beginning, when the component actually mounts. Okay, so let's save. Let's open up our browser. Let's refresh. So you'll see it does log name, right? But if we now click Learn React and update the name, it doesn't re-log it. So if we want to make sure that it actually does update the name, let's just go into the code here. And in here, let's just output name and then name. So this will just display the name that we actually have, but let's just do name.name, not the object. There you go. Okay, so you'll see right now name sen, we'll click Learn React. There you go. It re-renders. Name is now not sen, but it doesn't log it to the console because the use effect runs only once, only when we mount the actual component. So one big use for use effect is actually for calling backend APIs. So let's imagine this scenario, right? So we'll have a name here. Let's set the initial value to loading. Okay, so the name is loading, right? And then in here, in this use effect, what we'll do is we'll call a sort of a backend, a fake backend API. We'll set timeout. Here we'll say const res equals, I don't know, came from backend, okay? And we'll set name to the response from the backend. And let's set the timeout to 5 seconds, right? So you can imagine, so obviously this isn't a real backend. This didn't actually come from a backend, but it mimics sort of how it works, right? So it waits 5,000 milliseconds, so 5 seconds, that's while we're calling the backend. It returns the response, and then we set the response to the name here. So you'll see right now the way it'll work, right? And let's also update this to display the actual name since it's not an object. So it'll be loading, and then in 5 seconds came from backend. There you go. And so that's a very common use case of the use effect hook. So you have an initial loading state, right? On the component mount, as soon as the component mounts, you call the backend, and when you get that response, you set the name, and it displays here. Okay, so now we understand how to use effect to display, to run some action at the very beginning on the first initial mount of a component. But what about this dependency array? How does this work? Here's how it works. Here's how we can utilize it. Let's imagine this situation. We have a times name changed value, and we'll also set it set times name changed. This will also be a use state value. Let's set it to 0 initially, and here we'll just do const times name change. Nope. We'll say use effect. And in this use effect, we will, where did this go, by the way? Set name res. Use effect. Brain isn't working today. Okay. So we have this value, the times the name has been changed. Its initial value is going to be 0. And what we want to do is run this effect every single time that name changes, right? So to do that, we'll just add name to its dependency array. There we go, name. Just name to its dependency array. And now, every single time that name updates, it'll run this setup function, as well as on the first initial mount, okay? So what we'll do now is output this value times name has changed. We'll make it times name changed. There you go. Simple as that. So now that we have this, let's go into our code. We can see now that times name has changed is 2 because its initial value is 0. It runs initially and then it runs with this set timeout. And so it updates to 2. If we update this to, let's just add this back in. There you go. You can see now it's 1. And then once this changes, it updates to 2. So every single time that name changes, it'll rerun this function. Now let's set this to -1, just because this will run initially. It's not just every single time that name changes, right? So on the initial run, it'll set this to 0. And then after that, every single time that name changes, it'll be +1. So now you can see name's loading. There you go. It updates to 1. And now if we click on Learn React, we forgot to update this. Set name to just not send. There you go. Okay. So backend response comes, updates to 1. We'll change it manually. Updates to 2. And there you go. So this is the dependency array. Every single time that any value in this dependency array changes, it'll rerun this useEffect function. That's how this is utilized. Okay, so last thing that we do need to understand about the useEffect hook is that it actually has something called a cleanup function. A cleanup function is what we return from the useEffect setup function. So if we return something here, let's just say cleaning up, okay? And this will actually be run when this component unmounts. So when app unmounts, it'll run this cleanup function. And it's used, as its name implies, to clean up our components. So what if in this case, we want to, for example, let's set name back to loading, right? So we don't know what name will be, but when this component unmounts, we want to set it back to loading. And let's do same for set times changed. Set times changed, we'll set that back to -1. There you go. So this is what the cleanup function does. Let's demonstrate how it works now. We have this cleanup function. Let's go into our index.js. And in here, let's just do set timeout. We'll set it to 5,000, so 5 seconds. And what we'll do here is we'll just call root.unmount. There you go. All right, let's go to our browser. Let's refresh here. And you'll see right now when the component unmounts, there you go. You see it calls cleaning up. So this is, when this is run, root is unmounted, which includes app. It unmounts app, and then it runs this cleanup function that we returned from this useEffect. And if you are wondering why it's happening twice, it's just because we're running in strict mode. If we were to remove strict mode, it wouldn't run twice. There you go. You can see now it doesn't run. And then give it 5 seconds and it does run. And there you go. That's the use effect hook. And there we go. You should now understand how to access and manipulate state within React functional components. You should now understand how we can access lifecycle in React functional components. And of course, these two aren't the only hooks. There are many, many hooks within the React ecosystem. But what you'll find is that a lot of the business logic that we write within our components can be covered by these two hooks. Now, if you do want to learn more about hooks, specifically about how you can write your own custom hooks, click in the video in the top right corner.